There is a detail from the 1995 Chicago heatwave that I cannot stop thinking about. His name was Joseph Laszko, 68 years old, Hungarian descent, Northwest Side apartment. He lived alone, and he had lived alone for long enough that he had developed small rituals to fill the silence. He collected his neighbor's unwanted mail, stacked it carefully. He filled his apartment with old phone books, worn newspapers, broken radios that he kept anyway, shoddy furniture that nobody else wanted. But he still wanted, and he kept a calendar. Every day, he wrote down the temperature and noted the news stories that moved him. Investigators found almost nothing else of a social life. A few letters sent to him from Hungary in the 1980s, a bank statement showing his last withdrawal, $93, and an Easter card that he had written in 1991 and never sent. On July 15, 1995, Joseph Laszko made his last entry. 94 degrees. Nobody found him for days, not because nobody cared, but because there was nobody left who thought to look. His possessions, the letters, the calendar, the unsent Easter card, were packed into a cardboard box and filed away in a county building, where they remain today. Joseph Laszko didn't die from the heat. He died from the locked door. By the time the heat wave broke, 739 people had died in 5 days, more than twice the number who died in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, 20 times the number killed by Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The morgue ran out of space on day 2. They brought in refrigerated meatpacking trucks, parked them outside, and filled those too. On a normal day, the morgue received 17 bodies. On July 14th alone, it received 87. At the end of that month, 170 bodies were still unclaimed. Nobody came forward. Investigators searched and found nothing. No family, no friends, no one who had noticed they were gone. The city's first instinct was to look away. The mayor's commission called it a unique meteorological event, an act of God. Case closed. But Eric Klinenberg, a sociologist from Northwestern University, wasn't satisfied. He spent years doing what he called a social autopsy, not of the bodies, but of the city itself. And what he found was not what anyone expected. He found 2 neighborhoods, North Lawndale and Little Village, sitting literally next to each other, one street between them, a set of train tracks in places. Almost identical. Same poverty rates, same number of elderly people living alone, same temperature, same sun. And yet, North Lawndale had a death rate 10 times higher than Little Village. 10 times. When Klinenberg dug into why, he didn't find air conditioning. He didn't find income differences. He found the street itself. Little Village still had active commercial streets. Corner shops where the owners knew which elderly customers hadn't come in that week. Neighbors who noticed a curtain that hadn't moved. A community that had not yet been re-engineered for strangers. North Lawndale had been methodically stripped, not by malice, but by decades of disinvestment. Businesses pulled out, streets emptied. The places where people used to stop and talk to each other were gone. And when the heat came, North Lawndale had no early warning system, because its early warning system had always been its people. Klinenberg wrote this line, and I think it is one of the most important sentences written about cities in the last 100 years. When hundreds of people die behind locked doors and sealed windows, out of contact with friends, family, community groups, and public agencies, everyone is implicated in their demise. Not the mayor alone, not the utility companies, not the absent families. Everyone who accepted a city designed for isolation was implicated. That includes us. Now here's where I want to challenge something, because we heard the story of 1995, and we told ourselves we had the answer. Density, build upwards, get people closer together, more bodies per square mile, lower carbon footprint, safer city, problem solved. And I understand the logic. I really do. Think about a street in 1952, one lawnmower, that 12 families borrowed by arrangement, a wooden ladder that lived in the alley, available to whoever needed it, a car that took 3 different families to church on Sunday mornings. That street's carbon footprint was remarkably low, not because its residents were trying to save the planet, but because they knew each other well enough to say, "Can I borrow that?" Now think about a building that went up last year. 500 units, glass and steel, a gym on the 14th floor, a rooftop terrace, a building manager who sends emails but has never learned anyone's name. In that building, there are 500 vacuum cleaners, 500 blenders, each one used maybe 6 times a year, each one sitting silent for the other 359 days, because the person in 4B has never spoken to the person in 4C, and it would feel strange to knock on the door now, because it has been 18 months, and the moment has passed. A 2025 study, 8,000 households across Nordic countries, one of the largest of its kind, found something uncomfortable. When 2 adults simply move into the same building, the actual carbon sharing benefit is 4%. 4. Not because sharing doesn't work, but because sharing requires something that buildings cannot provide. It requires the willingness to ask, and you only ask when you trust, and you only trust when you know. We built the density, we forgot to build the relationship. And what Klinenberg understood, watching 739 people die in 5 days, was that you can put 500 strangers in a building, and every single one of them can still die behind a locked door. Proximity is not community. It never has been. Here is something that stays with me. In the heat waves of the 1930s, Chicago also sweltered. The temperatures were brutal then too, but people survived differently, because when the apartment became unbearable at night, they walked to the park. They slept on the shore of Lake Michigan. They lay in the grass next to strangers, who by morning were not quite strangers anymore. The park was the front porch. The shore was the social infrastructure. The grass was the climate solution, and nobody called it that. They just called it summer. By 1995, that behavior had disappeared, not because people became selfish, but because the city had been redesigned around the assumption that everyone would solve their own problems, with their own resources, behind their own locked doors. And that assumption killed 739 people. Klinenberg spent the rest of his career making a single argument, that what we need is not just better technology, not just solar panels and smart thermostats and carbon offsets. We need what he calls social infrastructure, the physical places where people stop and linger, where a shopkeeper says, "I haven't seen Mr. Lasco this week," where a neighbor notices a curtain that hasn't moved, where someone knocks on a door and says, "It's hot. Are you all right?" And here is the thing nobody is saying loudly enough. Social infrastructure is a climate strategy, not a soft one, not a secondary one, a primary one, because isolated people cannot build collective responses to collective problems. You cannot organize a neighborhood to share resources if you have never borrowed anything from it. You cannot hold a city together in a crisis if the city was designed to keep you apart. The climate crisis and the loneliness epidemic are not 2 separate crises wearing different clothes. They share the same architect, a century of building cities for consumers instead of communities. And the solution is not complicated. It is just quiet and slow and deeply unfashionable in an age that prefers an app to a front porch. Think about Joseph Lasco again, the Easter card he wrote in 1991 and never sent. Investigators found it 4 years later, in a cardboard box, in his apartment, where he died alone. We don't know who it was for. We don't know what it said. We only know he wrote it, and then decided against sending it. Maybe he thought it was too late. Maybe he thought they wouldn't remember him. Maybe he just ran out of time. The front porch is the sent Easter card, the neighbor who knocks, the shopkeeper who notices, the city that says, "We know you are here." We don't just need solar panels. We need front porches. We need to build cities where people die of old age, not of being forgotten. And we need to start before it gets hot again.